In 2006, Dr. Phil decided to do an episode where he shines a light on the homeless epidemic and hate crimes that these people were facing. Dr. Phil brought on what he probably thought was a slam dunk guest, one of the producers for the incredibly controversial film series Bum Fights, Ty Beeson. But when Ty was finally invited out onto the set in front of the cameras and the audience, he was dressed like this.
Stop the tape. I don't want to talk to you.
Why not?
That's despicable.
He gets kicked off the show pretty abruptly, and that's that, right? Well, this video makes the rounds on the internet every so often, and everyone just kind of takes turns talking about how terrible Dr. Phil actually is. But why is that? Is this an isolated incident, or has the Dr. Phil show been kind of going off the rails? Before we can really get into this, we should take a step back and look at Dr. Phil's history to get a sense of who he was before fame and where exactly he's coming from. Philip Calvin McGraw was born September 1st, 1950 into a working class family pinching pennies to get by. He and his family moved around a lot as his father kind of jumped from job to job. His father was an alcoholic and the family home was routinely in a state of chaos, but in the 50s, Phil's father Joe decided to quit his sales job and go back to school at the age of 40, where he would get his doctorate in psychology from the University of Oklahoma. Joe would eventually take his son Phil with him to Kansas City as he completed his psychology internship to keep him from falling in with a rough crowd. By the time he was in high school, Phil McGraw already had a receding hairline. He used his mature appearance to try and buy him and his underage friends alcohol from local bars. But this aside, at least at first, Phil didn't really stand out in high school, academically or otherwise. In fact, many of his former classmates didn't realize that the Phil they had known actually was Dr. Phil. But one of the most important things that would happen in Phil's life during this time is that he would start to date a young woman named Debbie Higgins, who Phil would marry later on. Phil would play sports in high school, with football being his main focus. In fact, Phil had said in the past that if it weren't for sports, he probably wouldn't have actually finished high school. And in fact, his grades weren't exactly stellar. But there are some discrepancies in how Phil recalls some things about his high school life. He, at one point, claimed to have lived alone after his father moved to Texas. But his then-girlfriend Higgins says that his mother and younger sister eventually moved to Kansas with him. So it's entirely possible that Phil is trying to make his life seem like it was more difficult, though he could have possibly hid the fact that he was living alone from his girlfriend. Though that seems pretty unlikely. In fact, most high school students would have probably taken advantage of such a situation, especially if they were in a committed relationship, but I digress. Phil would accept a football scholarship to the University of Tulsa in Oklahoma, where he would, of course, study psychology. This has really nothing to do with anything, but in one particular game, the team Phil played for would actually lose to Houston 100-6. Which, for anyone not familiar with football, is absolutely unheard of. But Phil's football career wouldn't last long, as he would go partially blind after an on-field injury, though his eye would eventually heal. Phil would then drop out of Tulsa and move with his family to Texas, and eventually Debbie Higgins, who he was still dating, would join him. The two would marry shortly after on November 27, 1970. And according to interviews Higgins would give much later on, the short-lived marriage was rough to say the least. According to her, Phil often told her that she didn't have the mental capacity to carry a conversation on. But according to interviews that Higgins has given, this wasn't all that happened during the marriage. Dr. Phil reportedly wanted her to maintain her physique and required her to start lifting weights. She said that Dr. Phil was a very controlling person and that she felt like she was in something similar to a mental prison. And eventually, Phil would begin to cheat on Debbie with other women. When caught out on this, he would become defensive and kind of brush it off as normal. The two would eventually divorce in 1973 after around 3 years of marriage. There's something incredibly ironic about the man who so publicly touts his marriage and morals being so generally terrible in a first marriage that's all been basically swept under the rug. Debbie sadly passed away in 2014. Phil would be continuing his education throughout all of this and would eventually receive his doctorate in clinical psychology in 1979 from the University of North Texas, which I guess is something that a lot of people don't know. Like, more than one person who I told about the idea for this video said something along the lines of, "Doesn't he not have a degree?" And the answer is that he definitely does. He is technically qualified as a psychologist, but is not currently licensed, something we'll get into much later on. Phil would eventually meet and marry his current wife, Robin, during his studies as well. He actually met her while still going through the annulment process with his first wife, and the two would marry in 1976. The now Dr. Phil would then go into business with his father, and the two would start a private practice. There's not a ton to talk about around this time, so we can jump ahead to the end of his run in the private practice sector. In 1988, Dr. Phil would have a major run-in with the Texas State Board of Examiners of Psychologists. Before we go any further, there's something that absolutely needs addressed. This whole thing that I'm about to get into has been misreported many times on the internet. It's something that I was originally putting more stock into than it realistically deserved, and as I dug deeper, it became clear that this really wasn't true. So what several sites had reported and is not true is that Dr. Phil engaged in a sexual relationship with a 19-year-old patient of his. Marital status aside, it's a huge ethical no-no for a psychologist. But what did actually happen is that Dr. Phil hired a former patient part-time, which is still a huge ethical no-no, but does actually make him out to be less of a terrible person than the alternative. The Texas State Board would place Phil on probation, which would end in 1990. But by this point, Dr. Phil was over and done with doing therapy. He would found a business with lawyer Gary Dobbs, One Courtroom Science Inc., or CSI. The idea was that the company would help with trial consultations, helping with litigation psychology, jury selection, witness training, and depositions. The company would be incredibly successful and work with a bunch of Fortune 500 companies. If you've ever seen or heard of the CBS show Bull, it's actually based on what the company was doing. Things for Phil were going incredibly well, but of course, they can always get better. Through his work at CSI, Dr. Phil would eventually be introduced to... So how Oprah ended up meeting Dr. Phil is kind of weird. The year is 1996. Oprah is airing an episode based around food safety. In an interview, Howard Lyman, an animal rights activist, says that mad cow disease would eventually affect the US beef industry. The interview is widely considered to be a major reason cattle prices dropped, and the beef market, especially in Texas, was not exactly happy about this. Paul Engler, Amarillo beef magnate and cattle feeder Hall of Famer, decided he was going to be the one to lead the charge against Oprah, alleging more than $10 million in damages. As Oprah prepared for trial, her legal team would tap the jury consulting company of CSI. Winfrey, who would go on to win the lawsuit unanimously, was apparently so impressed with Dr. Phil's work that she ended up inviting him onto her show. Oprah dedicated an entire episode of her show to what she dealt with in Amarillo, and as a crucial partner victory, Dr. Phil finally made his first Oprah appearance. But it wasn't until April 10th, 1998 that Dr. Phil would make his first appearance as a featured guest. The two would talk about a pretty wide range of topics, varying from commitments, losing weight, and goal setting. And the thing is, it actually went pretty poorly. Dr. Phil's more confrontational nature was pretty off-putting for what Oprah's audience expected to typically be on the show. But Oprah decided to bring him back onto the show and kind of warn the audience that he just tells it like it is. And with that, Dr. Phil was going on to Oprah every Tuesday and telling it like it was. Something that I read in the book The Making of Dr. Phil exemplifies it really well, I think. They had a kind of good cop, bad cop balance between the two of them, where Dr. Phil would be kind of in your face and Oprah would essentially reel him back in. But this is where we see Dr. Phil's penchant for one-liners to really begin to take hold of him. It seemed like no matter the problem an audience member had, Dr. Phil had the answer and could deliver his advice in an easy-to-dissolve manner. And we would still see Oprah directly oppose something that Dr. Phil had said and see him back down. Something that we rarely get a glimpse of nowadays. Around this time, Dr. Phil would release his first book, and with the help of Oprah, it sold exceptionally well, furthering Dr. Phil's rapidly amassing fame, with following books selling well as well. This would all eventually culminate in Dr. Phil breaking away from the Oprah show slightly to start his own show, instead of simply appearing weekly on Oprah. And on September 16th, 2002, the Dr. Phil show officially premiered. Now we can kind of switch gears a bit and get more into what we've seen on the show that's been going on for the last nearly 20 years that makes Dr. Phil kind of terrible. I know that was a lot of information about a daytime psychologist, but I think it's important to have a bit of a backstory for the man before we really get into it. But now that we have that, let's take a look at some of the more controversial things that have happened on the Dr. Phil show. In 2013, Todd Herzog, who had won the show Survivor, appeared on Dr. Phil. He was so intoxicated that he needed help to get to his seat, was slurring his words, and had an alcohol level of 0.263. On the surface, this seems like someone in serious need of an intervention and to talk to a psychologist. So, in theory, this would be the perfect place for him. But later, after becoming sober, Herzog alleged that both vodka and Xanax were supplied to him by the show's staff. In fact, Herzog actually claims that he was sober when he arrived at the studio. And according to Stat News and the Boston Globe, this might not be an isolated incident. One guest apparently brought heroin with the staff's knowledge, and a pregnant guest was actually filmed searching for a dealer in LA. The Dr. Phil show has stated that staff members can't direct or restrict behavior, but at the rate they seem to be going, it's simply a matter of time until someone dies. I mean, if they really did supply Herzog with both Xanax and alcohol, that's already a potentially deadly combination. But what about the younger people who really are getting help from Dr. Phil? Well, they're typically sent to the popular Turnabout Ranch. One of the more popular people to go there was 13-year-old Danielle Brigoli, also known as Bad Babby, you know, this girl.
Catch me outside, how about that?
In March of 2021, Danielle put out a video talking about what this experience was really like. She said that the teens slept on planks of wood, didn't get proper nutrition, were made to chop wood and take care of animals, which is, you know, just child labor. But here's the thing, instead of the children getting paid for all the back-breaking labor they were doing, their parents were actually paying over $30,000 to have their children subjected to crippling levels of fear. So why didn't the kids tell their parents about what was happening? Well, there was no cell phone service and outgoing letters were monitored by staff. These horrible conditions, of course, wouldn't have a happy ending. In 2016, while attempting to escape, Clay Brewer killed 61-year-old Jim Woolsey. While you can't justify what Clay did, it's not insane to think that this situation was at least somewhat preventable if he was just given the actual care he needs. This wasn't the place for him to get help because Turnabout Ranch is not a rehab center. They're not fully equipped to deal with kids going through withdrawal. If nothing else, kids need to not be sent here. So when you fully look at what happened with Danielle, you have a young woman who went on this show, obviously had some deep-rooted problems, was turned into a meme and was basically laughed at by the entire country. was then sent to a ranch where she was forced into labor and subjected to deplorable living conditions where a staff member was murdered. Gee, great job treating your patient here, Doc. Let's move on again to yet another controversial interview, this time with former actress Shelley Duvall. Unlike with some of the other, less famous folks that Dr. Phil paraded on the show, the Duvall interview gathered a pretty hefty amount of criticism at the time. Shelley Duvall is obviously someone who is not well mentally, and editing together a promo for this interview like it's an episode of fucking Bar Rescue is a different level of disgusting. We're talking about a woman who believes that Robin Williams, a co-star and good friend of hers, is still alive and shapeshifting. Any person with a shred of empathy would have either stopped this interview or at least not aired it. But despite the backlash she got for just the promo, including many tweets from various people, including Stanley Kubrick's daughter, Dr. Phil pushed ahead and ran with the interview regardless. And it turns out that she didn't even end up really getting any help from the whole deal. Shelley Duvall actually spoke pretty recently in an interview and kind of slammed Dr. Phil as well. If you want a much fuller breakdown of this whole interview from someone much more qualified than I am, Dr. Grande did an entire breakdown of this. There are a lot more controversies, but these few select examples I think do a good job of giving you the broad strokes of almost every other controversy you might see. If I were a licensed psychologist, I'd say that Dr. Phil is, or at least was, pushing himself to achieve some kind of mainstream success because he holds some kind of internalized feeling of inadequacy when it comes to his childhood and past. And of course, you really shouldn't listen to any of my joke psychological diagnoses because I'm actually not licensed to practice psychology. But to be fair, neither is Dr. Phil. At least not since 2006. And that was in Texas. He's never actually been licensed in California, where the show is filmed. Let's back up a bit to where we started this video. Ty Beeson, the producer behind Bum Fights, has shown up on Dr. Phil, shaved his head, and is dressed like Dr. Phil. He kind of goes off on Dr. Phil for a few sentences before being kicked off the show entirely. At first glance, this appears to be simply because Dr. Phil is disgusted by the man's films, which is fair, or because he's obviously mocking Dr. Phil, and the shock of having someone come out dressed like that could make someone feel that way. But that doesn't really hold up too well when you think about how TV actually works. Dr. Phil would have been warned about this ahead of time if he hadn't already seen Beeson backstage. But Beeson had to get through makeup, producers, and a whole crew of workers as well. It doesn't really add up that Dr. Phil wasn't aware of this stunt that Beeson was trying to pull. He probably just wanted to automatically have the moral high ground because Beeson is such a morally reprehensible person, and because that just kind of makes good TV. But when you watch the video back and actually listen, Ty Beeson actually does seem to make some good points.
If you think I exploit people, every time you bring a guest on this show, you exploit them and spread whatever problems they have to the whole world. You think that's helping them?
Yeah, keep telling yourself that. You can go.
In an odd sense, this is Dr. Phil staring into a mirror in more ways than one. Is Dr. Phil actively taking advantage of people by parading them and their problems in front of an entire nation? Let's look at the facts. At the end of the day, Dr. Phil isn't helping everyone on his show. And when you aren't getting help in a situation like this, you're just being shown off in front of a huge audience and a good chunk of America. Look once again at the Catch Me Outside girl. While she was able to twist the aftermath of the show into a successful rap career, there was a point where she was just a meme. In fact, that's probably how most people still know her at this point. Not everyone who gets embarrassed on the Dr. Phil show gets a lot of money and a career out of it. They just get embarrassed in front of the nation. But on the other side of things, according to Forbes, Dr. Phil made around $79 million in 2016. So yeah, the parallels between the producers of Bum Fights and Dr. Phil do seem to be incredibly strong. I don't think he's setting out to embarrass anyone in front of an entire country, And he probably really does want to help people. But somewhere along the way, Dr. Phil went from a psychologist who happened to be on TV to a TV star who did psychology. He was still trying to help people, but seemed to value ratings more than actually helping any of the people he's bringing on. If he can do both, great. If not, well, good luck. Sorry you're being difficult. The Shelley Duvall interview is the prime example of this. The Dr. Phil show has been renewed through 2023. From now until then, and most likely in the foreseeable future after that, I'm sure Dr. Phil will help some people. He'll also likely talk down to, embarrass, and negatively impact just as many. And he'll just make as much money, if not more, from these people who are being taken advantage of. But I can't help but think of the utter outrage that Dr. Phil showed as he stared into this strange mirror and didn't like what he saw. Is there really anything that makes him any different?
We're not so different, you and I.